So in the previous video, we were talking about solutions to externalities. And all the solutions we talked about involved government intervention. So we had bans and quotas and taxes. But there's one more solution I want to talk about, which I think deserves its own lecture because it's kind of unique, is what's referred to as the Coase Theorem. So the Coase Theorem says that if transaction costs are low, and their property rights that are clearly defined, then private bargains will ensure that the market equilibrium is an efficient outcome, even if there are externalities. So I'll underline two of these points, right? Transaction costs are low and property rights clearly defined, right? These are important caveats, and we'll look at what those conditions mean in a minute. Let's look at an example real quick. So the original example in the paper, which describes the Coase Theorem, is a farm with a train track running through it. So we have a train track coming through, and right next to the train track is a farm where there's a cornfield growing. And the issue is, as a train comes by, the wheels throw off hot sparks into the cornfield. And then so what happens is a fire erupts over here, and the farmer has to run out over here and throw water on it and put it out, and loses some of his crop every year because the train is starting fires in his cornfield. So this is obviously a case where the train or the railway company is imposing an externality on the farmer. They're driving by, delivering freight, throwing off sparks, and the cost of those sparks being thrown off are being imposed on the farmer. So our previous solutions, if we wanted to rely on government regulation, we could just regulate this and say either the farmer, you're not allowed to grow corn next to the train track, or the railway company, you need to move your train track. Well, the Coase Theorem says, remember, if transaction costs are low and property rights are defined, then a private bargain will reach the efficient market allocation. So let's think about what that means. First, let's look at property rights. So we need property rights to be well defined. So let's just assume that there is a property line, let's say right here. And so on this side is railway company's land, they own this. On this side is the farmer's land. And in our picture, the sparks are clearly being thrown onto the farmer's land and burning up his corn. So in this case, we're going to assume we have a well-defined property right. Clearly the train is infringing on the farmer's property rights by throwing sparks onto it. So we check that box. And now we need transaction costs to be low. Basically, this applies to legal costs. Typically, if you're getting a lawyer involved, legal costs are a lot and transaction costs are not low. But let's say that transaction costs are low and the train driver who's right there stops and gets out and talks to the farmer, and they negotiate. Well, the train driver could say, it's too expensive for me to not carry freight through here. We're going to lose too much money. So that's not an option. But what about if I pay you to not plant corn right next to the train tracks? So let's say the corn in this area, let's say that's worth $1,000 when the farmer finally takes it to market. Well, the train driver can pay the farmer $1,000 to just not plant corn here. And so now when the sparks fly off the train, they're landing in dirt or empty land and not lighting the cornfield on fire. But the farmer is happy because they got $1,000 and they don't even have to plant the corn. And the train driver is happy because he can run his freight through here and isn't being regulated by the government to stop running freight. So this is the canonical example of the Coase Theorem and how it can work. But you can see if we relax some of these conditions, this could fail pretty easily. So let's say transaction costs were not low let's say they couldn't reach a gentleman's agreement. Let's say the farmer hires a lawyer for $5,000, and the lawyer concludes that the train was in the wrong and it was throwing sparks onto the farmer's land, and thus the train driver needs to pay the farmer $1,000 to in damages to. Well, that still reached the same conclusion, but the farmer had to pay $5,000 in legal fees to get that solution. So it's not efficient. They're much worse off than they were just eating the $1,000 loss. So that's how high transaction costs can cause the Coase theorem to fail. The other is if property rights are not well defined. So let's mix this up a little bit. Let's say let's mix it up. Let's say instead of growing corn, the farmer is raising cattle. So here's an ugly looking cow. And let's say that the train is coming by and there's smog coming off of the smokestack into the grazing area, and the cow ends up dying from pollution from the train. Well, in this case, property rights are not obviously defined because the pollution is in the air, and we don't really define property rights for air, right? Who owns the air? And let's say even if the railway company owns the air above the train track, well, air moves. So as air moves around, how do you assign any property right to it? So even if you had low transaction costs and could hire a cheap lawyer in this case, you still might not reach an efficient outcome without being able to attribute whose rights were violated here. So anyway, that's the Coase theorem. Remember, if transaction costs are low or close to zero and we have well-defined property rights, then the market will actually take care of externalities on its own. In the real world, I would say transaction costs being expensive are usually what would cause this to fail in the real world. Basically, nothing gets resolved in the real world without a lawyer involved, which makes transaction costs very expensive. But in theory, when both of these conditions are met, the market allocation will actually be the efficient outcome, even in the presence of an externality.